Hey everyone, welcome to our session today, What Global Enterprises Need in a CDP. My name is JC Quimbow, Marketing Manager here at Treasure Data, and I'd like to introduce today's presenter, David Robb. David is the founder and CEO of the Customer Data Platform Institute. They are a vendor-neutral organization that helps companies make the most of their customer data. David is a longtime marketing technology consultant and industry analyst, and also coined the term Customer Data Platform, or CDP, in 2013. For some quick housekeeping, an on-demand recorded version of this webinar will be available. And lastly, we'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions during or after today's webinar, please submit them below and we will do our best to answer them. Without further ado, take it away, David.
JC, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us and welcome. So as you were just advertised, what global enterprises need in a customer data platform. So the CDP industry, as you no doubt are aware, has been growing dramatically. We now count north of 130 companies in the industry, which is great, except that means that there's north of 130 companies to choose from, which is a bit of a challenge. So let's talk today. Let's start about how do you actually do that? How do you actually find the right software? So selecting software in one level is not that hard. There's really three questions. What do I want to do? What's stopping you from doing it? And which CDP is the best solution? Of course, assuming that CDP is the best solution. So what do I want to do? Well, that really comes down to what programs I want to run, which in turn is based on what's my strategy, which is what I'd like to do, and what my resources are, which is what I can do. So now that I know what I want to do, the next question is, what's stopping me from doing it? And that is a question of, okay, I take my programs and I convert those into use cases, which are the tasks that are required to execute those programs. And then I look at what the needs are, the features I need to execute those tasks, compare those to my resources and see where the gaps are. What is it that I lack that's stopping me from running the programs I want to run? And then the final question is, which is the best solution? So I look at, well, what are the features available in the different systems, either the different CDPs or the different classes of systems? How do those match up against my gaps so I find the best choice? Okay, pretty straightforward. And as you see here, the real key to that is use cases, because use cases are sort of the connecting link here between everything else. Well, what's a use case, you may ask? Use case is not a big deal. It's the steps to complete a task. It's simply, I want to do something. Well, what are the steps that I have to go through to do that? So the CDP use case, at the end of the day, and we could spend a half an hour talking about that, but at the end of the day, a CDP use case is a use case that takes data from multiple systems. That's generally speaking why people find that they need a CDP, is because there's something that they can't do, remember, and the thing that they can't do is collect data or use data from multiple systems. That's when you find yourself saying, okay, I'm going to need a CDP to solve that. It's the best solution to close my gap. So that's pretty vague. Oh, CDP use cases. There are a lot of CDP use cases. This is a sort of a list that we pulled together. You could come up with more. So the challenge I always run into with CDP use cases is people say, well, what's the use case for a CDP? And first of all, well, not only are there a lot of use cases, but there are a lot of use cases. In fact, you can kind of imagine almost anything and say, well, that uses data from multiple systems, so that's a CDP use case. We kind of break them up into categories. The use cases that just involve data, so things like improving data quality. Then we think of use cases that involve analytics, like journey analysis or behavior analysis. And again, those are going to pull the data together from multiple places to do that properly. Things that require prediction, so any kind of predictive model will be better with more data. More data is like bacon, only better. Outbound campaigns are sort of the next. This is a bit of a maturity model, as you might imagine. So they would take our data, we take our predictive models, we now create lists either for email or for selecting personalized messages or whatever. And then we run real-time interactions, which of course involves real-time access to the data in the CDP, such as behavioral profiles, so tracking what people are doing as they're doing it, or selecting offers, or making content recommendations and so on. And then, of course, orchestration things across channels like retention campaigns or preemptive support. So watch customers to see who looks like they're having a problem and maybe jump in and offer them some help and so on. So no shortage of CDP use cases is really sort of the point that we are trying to make here. So let's just take one use case and kind of dig into that a little bit. Remember, we said a use case is the set of steps to complete a task. So let's take one use case, a classic enterprise CDP use case, call center next best action. And so we have our call center, and we want to tell the agent what the next right thing to do is based on all the information about the customer. And the thing that makes this a CDP use case is it takes data from multiple systems. In this particular instance, what usually the issue is we want to look at what someone has just done on the web, whether they made a purchase or which content they looked at, or maybe even what emails they opened. And the call center system, the CRM system, doesn't know about that. It knows about what happened in the call center and the notes of the previous calls. Maybe if you're really lucky, it's connected to a purchase system, so you know what products the person owns, but almost never is a native call system connected directly to a website to track behavior in real time, whereas of course that's exactly what the CDP is good at. So now that we know why this is a CDP use case, let's look at what the steps are. Here's 6 of them. So we're going to ingest data from all systems, build profiles, and share the data with analytics. That's one big case, but that's one large step, but it's all about data. Now we kind of switch our focus to the analytical system. We say we're going to analyze the customer behaviors, build that next best action model, and deploy the scoring algorithm into our campaign system. And now we're in the campaign system. We're going to load the algorithm, which is kind of like to receive it and be able to score people in real time, execute the algorithm in real time. Now we switch over into the call center, which we're assuming is separate from the campaign engine in this case. And we're going to have a customer come in, make a call. We're going to capture their behavior. We're going to capture their context. So what the situation is with this customer, what our inventory situation is, maybe from deciding whether what products to offer them, what the weather is locally, whatever the context is that's relevant, where they are physically. Could be relevant, say, if you're in a telco and you want to know if someone is roaming or not. So we capture that all information. Now we're going to run the campaign with including the data that the call center captured about the customer. We're going to execute our scoring algorithm, and we're going to recommend the best action. Then the campaign system is going to present that back to the call center agent. So if you want to map those steps against our little list of functionalities, data analytics, campaign delivery operations, we start off on the data side of things, step number 1. We then move into the analytics systems to analyze the customer behaviors, etc. We then go to step number 3, moving the loaded algorithm into the campaign system. We then have step number 4, way over there on the right, that says identify the customer. And we're going to combine that with, in step number 5, with data from the CDP back in that data thing that's going to run the campaign using both the data that was captured during the call plus the data that's stored in the customer algorithm, this customer database. So the customer profile, the historical data about that same customer. Those are both inputs to our scoring algorithm. It's going to come out with the best action. It's then going to present that action to the delivery system, to the call center agent. Okay, so pretty straightforward set of tasks to do. What's the big deal? Now let's look at the functions. Remember our little flow chart about use cases telling us what our needs are, what our functions are. So in the data side of things, we're going to assemble the data. We have data quality requirements. We have identity management requirements to figure out who this customer is. We have obviously a lot of privacy requirements. On the analytics side, in this particular use case, we have to do behavior analysis, and we have to build a best action model. In our campaign system, we have to ingest that model, and you may think I'm like obsessed with moving models back and forth, but that actually can often be a big stumbling block, is taking the model and actually getting it deployed so it can be executed in real time in an operational system. And we have other kinds of campaign rules and campaign execution. And so, this is when this campaign runs. These are the constraints. You don't offer these things to these people because we don't sell this product in this country, that sort of thing. In our delivery system, we just have to present the next best action. Actually, that's relatively straightforward. And then the operational system, in this case, might be our website. We have to capture the interaction data itself. And then, of course, we have to capture the results. So there's a fair number of things, of functions that the system has to execute. Now, those functions are going to happen whether I'm an enterprise or not. But for each of those functions, there are specific challenges that are faced by enterprises that wouldn't be faced by a smaller company. And this is, of course, where you guys, presumably everyone listening to this is an enterprise person. This is where you guys differentiate yourself. So let's look at that data assembly bit. So we need to ingest data from all sources, create unified profiles, expose the profiles, standard stuff. Enterprises tend to have lots of legacy systems. They're old. Mature is a polite term here. Like they're really cranky and crotchety. It's like the guy telling you to get off his lawn. They're hard to work with. Tend to have stuff on-premise. Not everybody likes to work with on-premise. Not every CDP can even be deployed on-premise. They have a lot of second-party data sharing, much more common. There actually has been research on this, that big enterprises are much more likely to share data with other big enterprises. Kind of makes sense. They have the data volume that makes it worthwhile to set up the details of a second-party data sharing arrangement. They tend to have multiple regional data centers. They tend to have a lot of variations that are local in their data. Different subsystems, or often different regional systems entirely, capture different kinds of data. So it's a lot of complexity in that enterprise environment, just in the data assembly side. Data quality, again, the description, standard stuff, analyze the data, define standards, identify the issues, remediate, monitor, and sort of, rinse, lather, repeat. Continue to do that stuff over time. Data quality never ends. Enterprises, more data sources, more volume, greater variety. They tend to have mature marketing, master data management, MDM, and quality programs in place. So hopefully your enterprise is kind of starting from a better place when it approaches its CDP, because a lot of that work is being done. A lot of enterprises, for all the legacy systems and all the other stuff we were just talking about, that they do have relatively mature environments. They've often made a lot of investment in their data. So you might be starting from a better place than you would be if you were in a smaller company that had never even tried to assemble its data before. But it also means you have to integrate with those systems. It also means that there might not be features that you need. If you have a good MDM system, and MDM includes identity management, and sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, then you don't have to go out and reinvent that wheel. You can just attach yourself or take advantage of the existing identity management features that your company has already invested in. Identity management itself, okay, again, loading personal identifiers, this identity management work, matching any new ID, any new identifier to an existing identity. Do I know this person? Do I know this phone number? Or can I somehow take this phone number, but I got other information with it, like an email address? Well, I know the email address, so I can already append that phone number to whatever identity already has the email address attached to it, or create a new one if you don't have any way to match this to an existing identity. Maintain those over time. Again, standard functions everybody has to do. Enterprises, again, more data sources, different kinds of identifiers by region. Phone numbers are in different formats, other kinds of IDs that might be available in one country or not in another country. Different match methods because you have different identifiers, different rules, different privacy rules, and different kind of constraints on how you use those identifiers by region. So just way more complicated when you start working across regions and when you start working in large volumes. And big enterprises are more likely to attract attention from the press and from regulators and from the kinds of people who want to find a mistake. So you have to be a little more careful when you're a big enterprise because you're a higher profile. Privacy. Yay, privacy. Discovering document location. This is just a normal privacy sort of processes. Again, find the data, capture and manage the consent, define the policies for data use, fulfill requests from customers if they want to see their data in their region where they have that right. So again, the enterprise challenge, again, just greater complexity, more jurisdictions, more systems. Talked a little earlier about having higher public interest. They want to do it on-premise, which adds like another layer of complexity because you can't use a lot of online tools. And again, they may have a lot of this stuff in place already. So if they do, that's great, but you still have to integrate it with the CDP. And just as a little side note, the CDP, because it does assemble all of your customer data in one place, often is the place that it makes the most sense to assemble your privacy features and functions. So you may, even if you have existing privacy tools, you may want to integrate them very tightly with the CDP, or possibly even get rid of the existing ones and use the CDP instead, because that is entirely possible, depending on the CDP. Best action models, again, assemble the data, conduct the analysis, deploy the algorithms. Enterprises tend to have in-house data science teams. That's on balance a plus. You have to work with those guys, so it's a little more work to keep them happy, but they are going to be available as a resource. They tend to have mature tools, again. So again, mostly a plus, but something that has to be sort of accommodated and integrated with whatever process flow you're going to have. And again, regional differences in products and behaviors are going to make that modeling a little more complicated. You might have to have different variations of your models, or entirely different models, depending on what the situation is for any given customer. So you get the idea here: more complexity, more complexity, more complexity. Campaign execution itself, again, standard process: identify the segments, send the lists, and capture the response. Enterprises, this is probably the most complicated thing in all. They have regional marketing teams, they have regional suppliers, they have regional campaigns, they have regional content. They may well have regional products, they certainly have regional offers. So everything is multiplied by however many regions you have. So way, way more complexity. They want support from a vendor 24/7, follow the sun, because someplace people are always working nowadays. Of course, people are always working, even in one place, because we all work close to 24 hours a day. And we have local compliance rules to deal with. Again, different rules, different regions or areas are going to allow me to have different things in my campaigns, different offers, different content, and so on. So way more complicated when you have to deal with enterprise campaigns. Operations, which in this case we say is our call center here. So the requirement for a little use case was to assemble those profiles in real time, then expose them to the support systems like the call center system. So multiple call centers in any big enterprise, multiple languages, again, 24/7. Support needed, so just more complexity to deal with. Multiple languages is especially fun. So, okay, that's all great. How do I find out if a system can do all those things that I just listed as an enterprise? Well, it really comes down to asking the right questions. You have to ask, well, can you do this? Can you do that? Can you do the other thing? So how do I know what those questions are? What are the questions to ask? Well, we'll give you some answers to the question of what questions you should ask. So questions to ask. Common enterprise requirements. These are things that are pretty typical, okay? And related to data collection, quality, all the things we just went through, right? So let's go through each of those. So data collection. Can you support all data types, including big data or unstructured data? Call it what you want. Can I do a schemaless data load? Extract, load, transform, not extract, transfer, load. So dump the data in and then fix it, or transform it, or understand it, or apply a schema to it, because you don't really know necessarily in advance how you're going to deal with it. And again, being an enterprise, you can have multiple input schemas, so you want to be able to rationalize those schemas after the fact. I want to be easily able to add new integrations because I have a lot of systems to integrate. So it can't be a huge process to add one new system. I probably have more issues with things like anonymization and pseudonymization. And of course, I have both digital and physical data sources, physical being things like in-store retail. So these are likely to be specific requirements for your system as an enterprise. Data quality issues, again, internationalization from global enterprise. Global location from an IP address if I'm tracking multi-region support. These are all specific questions. Does your system handle this? Or more helpful, how does your system handle this? Because the answer to does your system is almost always yes. The answer to the how may be, well, we have 1 million chipmunks doing it by hand, or actually we have a system, an automated system that handles it efficiently. Requirements for data platform, again, on-premise deployment, a particularly common requirement in the enterprise, and on-premise nowadays can include private cloud. In my definition, most enterprises kind of like accepted that private cloud is equivalent to on-premise deployment. They're going to have local servers, again, particularly from privacy requirements, that the data about a given people from a particular country can't leave the country or can't leave the region. We're going to have very fine-grained retention policies. Certain kinds of data can be kept for certain periods of time. You have to be really sure that stuff's available. We have to make sure that we remain highly available, because remember, we got that 24/7 operating requirement, so we can't just take the system down 5 hours every night to do updates and stuff. Not going to work in a global enterprise. Any resolution requirements of the enterprise, I'm probably going to want custom stitching rules. Yeah, there are generic stitching rules that most systems have with them, and stitching rules are really complicated. Stitching rules are the rules that determine how you match together two different identifiers. And again, we could spend hours on the topic. Customer identity management. If I have my own customer ID, how do I manage that? How do I manage the identifiers that I apply, not just to customers, but to any kind of identification? How do I integrate with MDM? Because remember that the enterprise is quite likely, actually, to have a fairly mature MDM system in place, MDM environment in place. Privacy rules, again, we have to support all the different ones. And, this is just GDPR, which is EU, and CDP, which is California, but Brazil has one. I was just talking to somebody from Nigeria yesterday. Apparently there's a Nigerian one. Pretty much every country has its own privacy rules these days. They're all just different enough to drive you crazy. Obviously, again, we have the sensitive data discovery, way more complicated when I have more systems. Consent capture, the rules are going to be different, managing it, responding to requests. Each of these varies based on the regulatory regime that applies, which usually has to do with where the person resides, could have to do with where they're a citizen, could have to do with a bunch of other stuff. So you have all these things that just get way more complicated in a big enterprise dealing with privacy. Analytical capabilities, remember, we have our friends in the data science team. That's great, but that means when they create an algorithm, we're going to want to import their algorithms. We're going to want to integrate with things like SAS and the tools like Python and Jupyter and all these cool things that those data scientists are going to tend to use. So that's an important set of functionalities, kind of yes/no questions, but sometimes it's a little more subtle than yes/no. Probably our analysts are going to want to access the data directly, making SQL queries, maybe not, but or other kinds of direct access to the data. So that's a really important question to ask, because not all CDPs make it easy to access their data. And then on the other side of the coin, the things that the data science team is not doing, our business users want to do for themselves. So what kind of capabilities do I provide for the business users to build their own models? That's really important, because there's way more models you might want to build than, frankly, even the most effective data science team can do. So you want tools that let business users do a lot of that for themselves, and you want good tools that put guardrails around so the business users don't do foolish things. And frankly, you want tools to prevent the data scientists from doing foolish things as well, although we think, at least theoretically, they're less likely to do foolish things, or if they do, it's harder to discover them. Audience management. So again, probably going to want separate audiences by country. On the other, we may, in some cases, want shared segment definitions. So loyal customers and loyal customers and loyal customer, no matter what country they're in. But then we might have different definitions as well. So some will be shared, some will be country by country or region by region. We're going to have some common governance rules. There's a corporate policy that says you can and can't do this. And then again, we'll have some local governance rules. We're going to have lots of segments. We're going to have lots of delivery integrations. So things just get way more complicated as we get into the enterprise. And these are all, again, questions to ask and things to look at to understand how many segments can you handle. Again, not just how many, so an infinite number, but how do you do that? Show me a segmentation that's got 1,000 cells to it. Show me how you set that up and how you manage that over time. Security admin requirements, of course, tons and tons and tons, and you have people whose entire job it is to ask those questions and to make your life difficult if they don't like the answers. Susan, I'm on the phone. You have data rights management if you're doing second-party data deals where you're sharing data with another company and there are limits to what you can do with that shared data. You're going to have requirements about encryption. You're going to have all kinds of user rights management, and you're going to have to, again, integrate with corporate ID systems. This is employee ID systems, although you're probably going to want to integrate with a corporate customer ID systems as well. You're probably going to have options for logging. So a lot of requirements that, again, are just simply more rigorous at the enterprise level. And again, your specialists will have a checklist that kind of goes through this, but you want to be able to first ask those questions and make sure that you're dealing with a vendor who's going to have good answers. You don't want to go through a long process, find a system you love, and then bring those guys in and say, oh, you can't use that system. They store all the data in Tanzania. We don't have a deal with Tanzania. If there's a place called Tanzania, I don't know if there is. So great. How do I get the answers to those questions? Now I know what questions to ask, sort of, kind of. How do I get answers? Well, glad you asked. Right, there are lots of tools. That's the good news, is we can public information. Go to the website, ask my friends in my personal network, demonstrations from vendors, building scenarios. So scenarios like, here's a particular use case, show me how your system does this particular set of tasks, not just show me a demo where you show me all the cool things in your system that may get me excited, but may or may not apply. Request for proposal, proof of concept implementation. And each of these has their own little strengths and weaknesses. Okay, the public information is available, but it tends to be vague and limited. The personal information network, if you have friends or people in your company, and almost always there are, in fact, people in your network who've worked with similar systems or even these systems, you get good answers, but, you're only going to have a limited coverage. Vendor demonstrations, they're great, but they're incomplete. Specific customer scenarios, you do get answers to specific questions, but only to the specific questions that you ask. So limited scope. RFPs, you can ask a lot of questions. That's the fun thing about an RFP. You get good detailed information, a lot of work to assemble them, and honestly, the answers often require a bit of interpretation and validation to make sure that you understand what's being said. And then proof of concept, doing a sort of a test implementation of the system, or it's not really a test implementation, but trial, because actually piloting could be another, which is a true test implementation. They're reliable because you're actually kind of seeing with your own eyes, but it's a fair amount of work. So each of these tools has its place. Now, of all of these tools, the one that both is, kind of hated the most, but also done right, the most useful, is the RFP. And the particular value of the RFP is you do get that detailed information. This is where you get to ask your 200 questions and get back the 100-page response that actually gathers it all in one place. It's all apples to apples if you're comparing multiple vendors. So even though RFPs are indeed a lot of work and effort to not just assemble, but also to interpret, take advantage of the answers, they are really valuable. So the good news here is that our friends at Treasure Data have an RFP template, huzzah, which does in fact give you all the questions. So you're wondering, well, Dave, you just listed all those questions to ask. How would I possibly know what questions I should ask, and in particular in an RFP, where I have so many questions? Well, here's an RFP template, which JC will somehow magically make available to you after this webinar, perhaps even before, that does have very specific, carefully crafted questions that get to the particular things you want to ask. Now, is every question on this template relevant to you? No. You do need to go through and, first of all, read them, make sure you understand what's being asked, make sure this is something that's relevant to you, make sure the question is kind of understandable. If it's not, you might want to clarify it, although I'm sure it's a perfectly grand template that the Treasure Data guys have pulled together, but even so. And so this is a starting base. This is not something you just hand off to all your RFP vendors, but it's a good place to start. It's a long list of questions that you can then assess. Yeah, I need this question. No, I don't need that question. So download that, makes your life way easier. Oh, finally, we get to the end here. So things you should remember. It's hard to select the right CDP. You could just buy Treasure Data. That's the easy answer. That's what they want me to say here. But, there are actually different CDPs for different people, and it's hard to find the right one. Having a systematic process is essential to doing it properly because it is hard. So the only way to do it effectively is to be systematic about it. Use cases are what you use to identify your key questions, and the RFP is what you use to get detailed answers to those questions. So hopefully that makes sense. Thank you. Here's my email, and the CDP Institute has all kinds of great tools. And JC's email if you want to ask a question, particularly to treasure data. So JC, back to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, David, for the great presentation. A lot of helpful information. So we can now take some questions from the audience. So it looks like we have, well, the first question is, will the deck be made available? Yes, the deck will be made available on BrightTalk as an attachment after this webinar. I'll upload it just for you guys. So we have a second one here. How do you know which use cases to tackle first, David?
Okay, that's a great question. And there actually are two answers to that. Okay, and probably the better answer is, well, where's your greatest pain point? So just having this discussion earlier with somebody today. And it's, oh, there's, how do people know what the, how do people know if they need to see? Look, people, they have a problem to solve. Usually by the time they've reached out to CDP vendors, they have a specific thing they want to do. So if that's like your big pain point and it's not crazy complicated, then start there. The other answer, which is the more kind of officially accepted answer, is you do things incrementally. You start small, so take a relatively simple use case, couple of data sources, relatively limited processing, couple of output systems, or maybe even no output systems, and kind of do that, and then just build over time. And this is where we get into crawl, walk, run, and eat the elephant one bite at a time, and take the low-hanging fruit, and all those other great cliches. We do see a certain progression. Remember before when I had that little use case list, we said they're kind of in an order. So the first thing you do is assemble your data. So if you have a use case that just requires assembling your data, like say data quality analysis, that's a good place to start because it only uses a limited set of functions. And then the next thing usually is, again, some kind of analytics. Let me do some customer journey analysis that I couldn't do because the data wasn't assembled before. Then add in maybe predictive modeling, then you finally can get into things that involve output. So you can imagine that progression of use cases. But the key is, again, just sort of do things slowly, incrementally, add a little complexity with each new use case, find ones that kind of build on each other so you don't have a dead end, that you build this cool function and you can't use it. So hopefully that answers. But if you want to start with that list of use cases that we gave a few slides back and kind of take them from left to right, that wouldn't be there are many worse ways to do it than that.
Okay, thanks, David. So we have one here. Can you speak more to the global part?
Okay, I don't know exactly what's being asked, but remember that global organizations have data from different countries. You don't have to pay me extra for that answer, JC. That's kind of like, you probably knew that already. So that data is going to be in different formats, and it's going to be, again, constrained by different rules. So it becomes way more complicated. You may actually have to have your data on different servers in different regions to comply. So it gets way more complicated. This is something that not all CDPs can do. So that's a very important set of questions to answer. So once you figure out, what does my global operation imply in terms of requirements? Do I need, again, those regional servers? Do I need to deal with, kanji data, not or non-Roman alphabets? What kind of data sets do I need to deal with? All those kinds of questions. Then you have to just, again, make sure that you find a vendor and ask the vendors if they can do it, and then to show you, again, how they can do it. So I don't know if that's super helpful or not, but those are kinds of the issues that come up in global organizations. Sorry, I can't do a better job.
Okay, we have our next one here. How do I decide whether to build or buy a CDP?
Oh dear. Well, it's a very important question. It comes up a lot, especially in big organizations, okay, where you have a big IT department, they kind of know what they're doing. And it's not an easy answer. It's easy to be glib about it. It's like, well, why, if you can buy it, why would you build it? It's always cheaper to build than it is to buy. Then you talk to the IT guys. No, not really. we have a mature environment, we can make a few tweaks here, we can get what we need. Is it really cheaper for us to start and customize a system, a purchase system from scratch, or configure, customize package software? So you have to look at, again, where you're at, what would it take, but not just to meet my initial set of requirements. Yeah, I might have a couple of specific things that I want to do, and the IT guys say, yeah, that's a couple months effort, whatever it is. But then you're going to have more after that, more after that, more after that. And those couple months of efforts kind of tend to add on to each other, and suddenly you're looking at 2 or 3 year backlog. So while you're making that assessment of how much incremental work is required to just build it yourself, be sure you really look at the whole thing. And bearing in mind that when you buy a package CDP, a lot of those functions are going to be built in. So even if the time to deployment of solving the first problem, if you will, is the same couple of months, either way, solving the second, third, and fourth problem will often be way quicker in package software. So just bear that in mind when you do your analysis. But I have to be honest, it's not necessarily a slam dunk. Package software is always better, even though that's my personal perspective, and I'm sure my friends from Treasure Data would agree.
Okay, thanks. So we have another one here. Are there best practices for evaluating and procuring third-party data in parallel to onboarding a CDP?
There sure are, and I don't have the right set of slides. Again, it's a long discussion, but there's third-party data has gotten way complicated because of the privacy issues now. So you used to fundamentally worry about quality of the data, and quality has a number of dimensions. First of all, is it accurate? But second of all, how much coverage do I have? So I could have great accurate data, but only cover 3% of my population. Not necessarily all that helpful. Is it all consistent? Because it could be accurate, but the date, like the phone numbers, could be all different formats, and the dates could be all different formats, and they're all correct. So that may sound stupid, but if you're pulling data out, say, of a CRM system where it's typed in by hand, well, the CRM operators weren't really worrying about consistency. They just wanted to enter something that made sense to them when they looked at it. So you couldn't have consistency issues even on accurate data. And there are other dimensions to quality as well. I think, well, I count 6. So look at the quality issue. Really the only way to do it is to get a sample of data and test it. But even that is something that sounds simple, but what exactly am I testing? What's the truth set that I'm testing against? Do I know the right answers? How do I know the data is accurate? Back in the day, we used to just call people up on the phone and ask them, hey, is this your current address? But that probably doesn't work that well anymore. And then the other dimension, as I say, is the privacy. Is that if this is data that's third-party data, it has to be collected with proper consent nowadays. So you really need to be able to chase that data supply chain back and document that, yeah, this data really is data that was collected in such a way that I'm allowed to use it. Bear in mind that the rules keep changing anyhow. So even if it was properly collected at the time of collection, it may no longer meet the current rules. So you have a number of rules, but those 2 big buckets of assessing the quality, which really means just testing it out. There's no other way to do it. And also, incidentally, best practices from a global perspective is, if you have a global supplier, they're in turn getting different suppliers from different regions. So just because their data is great in the UK doesn't mean their data is great in France, let alone the data from Africa or from Brazil. So again, you have to really be careful and look at it. And averages are really misleading in something like that. It might be 80% accurate on the whole, but that's because it's 90% accurate in the UK and 50% accurate in Brazil. So you really have to just dig into that stuff.
Okay, and it looks like we have one more here. So RFPs are a lot of work. Is there a way to avoid them?
Yeah, you don't have to do an RFP. You could just go blindly and hope things go for the best. Not kidding. It's funny. RFPs have kind of almost gone through a bit of a hype cycle of their own, if you will. We used to always do RFPs. I'm talking back when I was a youth. And then people got really frustrated with RFPs because they were so much work. The vendors in particular really hated them. And people overused them, and they would send out RFPs to 20 vendors, even though only a handful of those. So RFPs kind of got a bad rep. And then people cut back and say, let's just run some scenarios. There's other ways to kind of get our questions answered. But first of all, if you're an enterprise, you probably have a procurement team that simply isn't going to give you the choice whether they have an RFP or not. But even if you have that choice, the RFP really is good at getting a lot of questions answered. So if you use it wisely, only send out, I don't do RFPs anymore, but I don't do vendor selection anymore. Back when I did, I would never send out more than 5. I mean, to me, that was the maximum. So somebody sends out 10, 20 RFPs. It was just a waste of time. And people in the industry talk, so they knew who was doing that. And the vendors would often just not even bother to respond if they knew this was an RFP that was going to everybody under the sun. And I'm not answering the question about how to avoid. So if you have a specific set of questions that you can get answered through scenarios or demonstrations or through a proof of concept, then you might be able to avoid an RFP, okay? The thing about proof of concept, again, think about that hype cycle. Proof of concepts are sort of hot, right? Everybody loves proof of concepts. And it used to be the proof of concepts were a lot of work. And the vendors really hated them, and they would charge you for them, and they got a lot of pushback. Because now we're dealing with more packaged software, with more more creative, more properly packaged software. I'm struggling for the word here. It's actually easier because the packages are good, and actually is way easier to deploy a packaged CDP than it was to deploy something 5 or 10 years ago, and there's still a lot of customization involved even in the deployments. So people tend to do POCs, but again, like RFPs in days of yore, people tend to overuse POCs. So I've had somebody more than once actually say to me, we're not going to bother to understand CDPs. We're just going to run a bunch of POCs, and we'll figure it out as we go along. And that is such a bad idea. Okay, the POC has a specific role in the cycle. The POC is if there's a particular question that I can't get answered any other way, there's something I really need to test that the system truly can do, like how good is it at any resolution in Taiwan or whatever, some particular thing that I just can't look at the system, I can't look at a demo, I can't even have them do a scenario for me. The only way to get that answered is really to do an actual proof of concept implementation. Then you want to do that. And you should only do it with 1 or 2 vendors. You shouldn't do it. It's because it's even more within an RFP, right? So you want to be really careful about how you do your POCs and use them just in that way, just really when you're narrowed down to a small number of vendors, when you have a manageable number of issues that are not resolvable any other way, because most of the things you could get answered through a scenario or through an RFP. And then, as you go through the RFP and you see answers that are like, this answer doesn't make any sense, or this doesn't jive with what I saw in the demo or in the scenario exercise, then you go back at the vendor, you poke at them, and then you might need a POC if you really can't resolve it any other way.
Great. Thank you, David. That was very informational. So I think that's all the questions we have in the time today. So I just want to thank David again for the great presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us today for the webinar, What Global Enterprises Need in a CDP. We will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.